Veracruz, Mexico, March 15, 1847. The sun had not yet fully risen when Don Sebastián de Mendoza y Córdoba strode through the marble corridors of the Hacienda San Miguel del Rosario with determined steps. His 24 years carried a determination that would make any father tremble, but not with pride, with pure fury. He wore his finest white linen suit, the waistcoat embroidered with gold thread that his mother, Doña Mariana, had commissioned from Madrid, especially for his marriage to Doña Isabel de Alvarado. But it would not be Isabel who would walk down the aisle that morning. The chapel on the farm began to fill with Veracruz's elite. Don Antonio Velázquez arrived with his wife, Doña Beatriz, displaying jewels that shone brighter than the rising sun. Don Carlos Hidalgo came accompanied by his 3 sons, all dressed like little princes. Don Fernando de Mendoza, the patriarch, absolute master of more than 2,000 enslaved souls, occupied the front pew with a satisfied smile on his face. He believed he was about to witness the union that would consolidate his empire, his only son marrying the heiress of the Alvarado family, uniting the 2 largest fortunes in Veracruz. But when Father Ignacio Morales announced the bride's entrance, the silence that fell over the chapel was not one of admiration. It was one of absolute horror. Jimena entered barefoot. Her calloused feet trod the cold stones of the chapel for the first time in her life. She was 19 years old, but she looked 40. Her dress wasn't white lace from Paris, but a simple piece of raw cotton that Citlali, her best friend, had washed 3 times the night before to remove the stains of dirt and blood from working in the sugarcane fields. Her black hair was loose, falling over her thin shoulders, and her hands trembled as she held a small, rough wooden crucifix. She was Zapotec. She was a slave, and she was about to become the wife of the richest and most desired man in the entire region. Don Fernando rose, so abruptly that the wooden bench creaked like a scream. His face, normally flushed from the French cognac he drank every night, turned as red as embers. "This is an abomination," he yelled, his voice echoing off the stone walls. Doña Mariana dropped her ivory fan and clutched her chest, her eyes rolling back before she fainted in a maid's arms. Don Antonio and Don Carlos exchanged glances, scandalized but also fascinated by the spectacle of self-destruction they were witnessing. Sebastián smiled, not a smile of happiness, but of accomplished revenge. For years, he had been his father's perfect puppet. He had studied law in Mexico City against his will. He had returned to manage the ranch when he would have preferred to be far from that hell. He had accepted endless dinners with the Alvarado family, feigning interest in Isabel, while Don Fernando planned every detail of a future Sebastián had never chosen. And now, finally, he had found the perfect way to destroy all those plans. To tarnish the Mendoza name forever. To turn his father into the laughingstock of all Veracruz. The wedding proceeded amidst indignant murmurs. Father Ignacio, pale as the consecrated host, stammered the words of the sacrament. Jimena could barely lift her eyes from the ground. She didn't understand Spanish perfectly, only enough to follow orders in the fields. She didn't understand why she had been taken from the slave quarters at 4 in the morning, bathed with cold water by 2 frightened maids, dressed in that clean cloth and dragged there. She didn't understand why that light-eyed man, whom she had only seen from afar mounted on his Andalusian horse, had suddenly decided to make her his wife. Outside the chapel, pressed against the barred windows, dozens of slaves watched the scene with a mixture of terror and confusion. Tlaloc, Jimena's older brother, had his hands clenched into fists so tight that his nails dug into his palms. He knew that world better than anyone. He knew that when the masters did something unexpected to the slaves, it rarely ended well. Citlali wept silently, praying in Zapotec for the ancestors to protect her friend. Yolotl, the oldest slave on the plantation, at 67 years old, and with a back scarred by decades of whipping, shook his head slowly. He had seen it all, and he knew that this was not love. It was something far more dangerous. When Father Ignacio finally uttered the words, "husband and wife," Don Fernando stormed out of the chapel like a hurricane, knocking over candelabras and making the silver crucifix on the wall tremble. The other gentlemen followed him, not without first casting disapproving glances and morbid curiosity at Sebastian. The ladies, scandalized, covered their daughters' eyes as if Jimena were too obscene a sight to be witnessed. And there, in that stone chapel built with the sweat and blood of thousands of slaves over generations, began a marriage that was anything but sacred. Sebastian had achieved his revenge, but he never imagined that in just 4 days, that impulsive decision would transform into something that would change not only his life, but the destiny of hundreds of people. Because sometimes the choices we make to hurt others end up hurting ourselves in ways we could never have predicted, and sometimes, from the most bitter poison, an unexpected redemption can spring forth. But he would only find that out when it was too late to turn back. If you love historical dramas that start with scandal, sign up now for brutal stories of slavery, because Day 4 will leave you breathless. To fully comprehend the gravity of what Sebastian had done, you need to delve into the brutal and stratified world of Veracruz in 1847. This was no ordinary farm. It was an empire built on bones, blood, and suffering, systematized by 3 generations of the Mendoza family. The hacienda San Miguel del Rosario stretched across more than 15,000 hectares of fertile land. Its sugarcane fields undulated under the Caribbean sun like an endless green sea. Its coffee plantations produced the most coveted beans in the region. Its stables housed Andalusian horses imported directly from Spain. And its slave quarters, strategically built far from the main house, so that the nightly groans would not disturb the sleep of the masters, imprisoned more than 2,000 souls. Don Fernando de Mendoza y Córdoba was not merely rich. He was powerful in a way that transcended money. At 52, he controlled not only his ranch, but also influenced political decisions in Veracruz, and had connections that reached as far as Mexico City. His word was law. His will was decree, and his cruelty was legendary among the slaves, who whispered his name with the same dread with which one speaks of the devil. He had inherited the farm from his father, Don Augusto de Mendoza, who in turn had received it from Don Rafael de Mendoza, the founder of the family empire. 3 generations of men who saw human beings as property, who branded people with hot irons as if they were cattle, who separated families with the same indifference with which one separates the wheat from the chaff. Don Fernando had perfected the system of exploitation. He had hired Don Rodrigo Salazar as the head overseer, a man whose reputation for violence made even other overseers cower. Sebastian grew up breathing this poisoned air. His earliest childhood memory was watching, from the veranda of the big house, the slaves being led in chains from the boats in the port of Veracruz to the plantation. He was 5 years old and asked his wet nurse, Isel, a middle-aged Zapotec woman, why those people wore chains. Isel lowered her eyes and replied in a trembling voice, "Because the masters are afraid, little chief. They are afraid of what would happen if we were free." At the age of 10, Sebastian witnessed his first public flogging. A slave named Tonatiuh had tried to escape. He was captured within 2 days and brought back. Don Fernando ordered all the slaves to be gathered in the central square of the farm. Don Rodrigo stripped Tonatiuh and tied him to the post. 50 lashes. Sebastian remembers each number counted aloud, each scream that tore through the hot afternoon air, the blood running down Tonatiuh's back, forming red puddles on the beaten earth. He remembers vomiting in the garden and his father saying in a cold voice, "Get used to it, my son. This is necessary to maintain order." At 15, he knew longer vomited. He no longer averted his eyes. Violence had become part of the landscape, a natural part of the world. He studied Latin in the morning, while outside slaves worked 16 hours under the sun. He ate 5-course banquets, while in the slave quarters, entire families shared a piece of stale bread and thin broth. He slept in silk sheets, while people slept on straw mats on dirt floors. Don Fernando had grand plans for his only son. He sent him to study law in Mexico City, where Sebastian mingled with other children of the elite, all of whom would become landowners and slave owners. But something happened during those years away from home. Sebastian began reading banned authors. He met people who spoke of abolition, of human rights, of concepts that his father would consider heresy, and when he returned to Veracruz at the age of 22, he was a changed man, not changed enough to free the slaves or renounce his fortune, but changed enough to hate his father with increasing intensity, to see the hypocrisy in every Sunday Mass, where Don Fernando prayed the Lord's Prayer while planning to buy more pieces at the next auction, to feel disgust at the dinners where the masters talked about slaves with the same coldness with which they discussed the price of sugar. It was in this context that Sebastian met Jimena. It was an afternoon in August 1844. He was riding through the sugarcane fields inspecting the work, fulfilling his role as the future heir, and he saw her. She was only 16 years old, but she worked with the ferocity of someone who knows that any show of weakness means punishment. Her thin arms cut cane with precise movements. Her face was covered in sweat and dirt, and when she raised her eyes for a brief second and met his gaze, Sebastian saw something that deeply disturbed him. He saw no fear, no submission. He saw fierce dignity. He saw a soul that refused to be completely broken, even imprisoned in that hell. He began to observe her, not with romantic desire, but with almost anthropological curiosity. He discovered that she was the sister of Tlaloc, one of the most respected slaves among the Zapotecs, that her mother, Xochitl, had died 3 years earlier from exhaustion in the fields, that she sang in Zapotec while she worked, songs that spoke of distant mountains and ancient gods, that Don Rodrigo watched her with the predatory gaze that usually preceded violence. And when Don Fernando announced that he had arranged Sebastian's marriage to Isabel de Alvarado, when he began planning the ceremony that would unite the two greatest fortunes of Veracruz, something inside Sebastian broke. He didn't want to marry Isabel. He didn't want to perpetuate that cycle. He didn't want to become her father, but he also didn't know how to escape. Until the idea arose, poisonous and seductive. What if he destroyed everything? What if he took the most precious thing to his father, the surname, the reputation, the family's future, and burned it completely? And what more effective way to do that than to marry a slave? It wasn't love. It was existential vandalism. It was a son destroying the temple his father had built. And Jimena was, tragically, merely the chosen tool for that destruction. She didn't know, as she worked in the sugarcane field that March morning, that she had been selected not for who she was, but for what she represented, the ultimate offense Sebastian could commit against everything Don Fernando valued. This was the world in which that impossible marriage took place. A world where people were property, where love was the privilege of those with fair skin and the right surname, where an act of rebellion by a rich young man meant dragging a young slave girl into a destiny she never chose and could never have imagined. Write scandal in the comments. Do you think the elite would applaud or destroy this marriage? The ceremony ended in a silence as heavy as lead. Father Ignacio Morales closed the register with trembling hands, crossed himself 3 times as if he needed divine protection against the sin he had just witnessed, and left the chapel without looking back. The few guests who remained, more out of morbid curiosity than respect, dispersed, murmuring amongst themselves, already planning how they would spread the scandalous news throughout Veracruz. Sebastian gripped Jimena's arm with unnecessary firmness and led her out of the chapel. She stumbled on the stone steps, unaccustomed to walking without being bent over the plantation. He didn't even look at her. His eyes sought only one person, Don Fernando, who stood near the stables, surrounded by Don Antonio Velázquez and Don Carlos Hidalgo. The patriarch's face was petrified in a mask of hatred so pure it seemed to radiate heat. "You destroyed this family," Don Fernando said as Sebastian approached, his voice low and controlled in a way that was more terrifying than any scream. "3 generations building. This name, this legacy, and you destroy it in one morning because of this thing." "My wife," Sebastian corrected, and for the first time Jimena heard something in his voice that made her shudder. It wasn't affection, it was cruel triumph. "Mrs. Jimena de Mendoza y Córdoba. Technically, she now has more legal rights than any of those slaves you value so much." Don Antonio Velázquez let out a nervous laugh, but immediately fell silent before Don Fernando's murderous gaze. Don Carlos shook, his head slowly, like a father disappointed with a troubled son. "Sebastian," he said in a falsely paternal voice, "there's still time to undo this. We can say you were drunk, that you were coerced, that—" "There is no annulment," Sebastian interrupted. "The marriage has been consummated." A lie, but an effective lie. Don Fernando recoiled as if he had been punched. Doña Mariana, who had been carried to the veranda of the main house after her fainting spell, let out a sharp groan and covered her face with her hands. "So you are no longer my son," Don Fernando pronounced each word as if he were hammering nails into a coffin. "You will continue to live in this house because legally it is your right as my heir, but you are dead to me, dead to your mother, dead to this family, and that creature you brought to desecrate our name. She is also dead. You two are ghosts walking through this hacienda." Sebastian smiled. He had succeeded. He had irreparably wounded his father. But as he turned to return to the big house, pulling Jimena behind him as if she were a dog on a leash, something icy pierced his chest. For a second, he saw their reflection in a window. He tall, dressed like a prince. She small, barefoot, her raw cotton dress already dusty. And for the first time, a pang of something akin to guilt struck him. Not for defying his father, but for having used a human being as a weapon in a war that wasn't hers. He immediately dismissed the feeling. There was no room for doubt now. The main house of the Hacienda San Miguel del Rosario was an imposing 2-story building with thick white walls that kept the interior cool even under the scorching Veracruz sun. It had 23 bedrooms, 3 living rooms, a library with over 1,000 volumes, a private chapel smaller than the main one, and a dining room that comfortably accommodated 40 people. The indigenous maids, Yaretsi, Nayeli, Ixchel, moved silently through the waxed corridors, invisible to the masters. Eyes, always present but never noticed. Sebastian led Jimena to the second floor, through corridors decorated with paintings of Mendoza ancestors that seemed to judge them from their gilded frames. He stopped before a door at the end of the east corridor, the most secluded part of the house. He opened it and pushed Jimena inside. The room was small by the standards of the large house. It had been used as a pantry before being hastily converted that morning. There was a narrow bed with simple white sheets, a small, dark wood table, a chair, and a window overlooking the sugarcane fields. Nothing else. No mirror, no wardrobe, no rug. A room that made it clear that its occupant was not a real wife. She was a prisoner, with the title of mistress. "You will stay here," Sebastian said, still not looking directly at her. "Don't leave without my permission. Don't speak to anyone. The maids will bring you food. You have water over there." He pointed to a ceramic jug on the small table. "That's all you need to know." Jimena finally found the courage to speak. Her voice came out hoarse, rough from being unused for so long. "Why?" The Spanish word came out distorted, with a strong Zapotec accent. "Why me?" Sebastian finally looked at her. He really looked. He saw a young woman of 19 who weighed perhaps 40 kilos, her arms scarred from cutting sugarcane, her hands calloused from incessant work, her eyes sunken from chronic hunger. He saw someone who had lived through more pain in her 19 years than he would in his entire life, and for a moment, just a moment, he felt the crushing weight of what he had done. "Because you're nobody," he said, the cruelty returning to his voice like armor. "And I needed nobody to make my father understand that he doesn't control me anymore." He left and locked the door from the outside. Jimena stood in the center of the room, trembling despite the heat. She looked around at the space that was simultaneously a prison and a palace, more comfortable than anywhere she had ever slept, but infinitely more terrifying. Slowly, she knelt on the wooden floor and pulled from the neckline of her dress the rough wooden crucifix that had belonged to her mother, Xochitl. "Mommy," she whispered in Zapotec, tears finally streaming down her dirty face. "Where am I? What's happening to me?" In the slave quarters, news of the marriage had spread like wildfire. Tlaloc was beside himself. He paced back and forth in the cramped space of the hut he shared with 12 other slaves, his hands opening and closing as if trying to break something. "They're going to kill her," he repeated, his voice thick with anger and fear. "This isn't marriage. It's a death sentence. Don't you understand?" Chitlali, sitting in a corner with her knees pressed against her chest, wept silently. She and Jimena had been friends since childhood, had grown up together in the sugarcane fields, shared the same nightmares, the same impossible dreams of freedom. "We need to get her out of there," she whispered. "We need—" "And what to do?" Yolotl interrupted, his voice weary from decades carrying bitter wisdom. The old slave sat on the hard-packed earth floor, his back against the wooden wall. "Run away? You know what happens to those who try to run away. You saw Tonatiuh, you saw Nekali, you saw Quetzal, all dead or scarred so deeply that they wished they were dead. So we're not going to do anything?" Tlaloc exploded. "Leave my sister there alone with those demons? We will survive," Yolotl said simply. "As we always have, as our parents did, as our children will. Jimena is strong, she will find a way, and perhaps—" He hesitated, his old eyes fixed on a distant point, as if he could see something that others did not see. "Perhaps this is the beginning of something. I don't know what, but the gods do nothing without reason." Meanwhile, in the main house, dinner was served in glacial silence. Don Fernando sat at the head of the long mahogany. In table, Doña Mariana to his right, her eyes red from crying. Sebastian took his usual place, but now seemed separated by an invisible abyss. No one spoke, only the sound of silver cutlery clinking against porcelain echoed through the room. Don Rodrigo Salazar, the overseer, entered silently and approached Don Fernando, bending down to whisper something in his ear. The patriarch listened, his jaw clenching, and nodded slightly. Sebastian observed the exchange, but couldn't hear what was said. He didn't know that Don Rodrigo had just received orders to resolve the slaves' problem as soon as an opportunity arose. He didn't know that his father was already planning Jimena's death to appear accidental. He didn't know that by using her as a weapon, he had signed his own death warrant. That night, Jimena couldn't sleep. She lay on the narrow bed, still dressed in her wedding dress, and stared at the dark wooden ceiling. Through the window, she could see the dim lights of the fires in the slave quarters, where her people slept huddled together. In the distance, she could hear someone singing a Zapotec lullaby. She recognized the voice. It was Isel, the same woman who had once been Sebastian's wet nurse, now too old for the hard work in the fields. Jimena closed her eyes and remembered the last time she saw her mother alive. Xochitl was lying on a mat, her body consumed by the fever that the masters refused to treat because sick slaves had no value. With her last breaths, she held Jimena's hand and said in Zapotec, "Don't let them break you from the inside, my daughter. They may possess your body, but your soul is yours. Remember who you are. Remember where we came from." "Mom," Jimena whispered in the darkness of the locked room, "I don't know who I am anymore." And so ended the first day of the most scandalous wedding Veracruz had ever witnessed. A wedding without love, without respect, without hope. Just two people trapped in a snare that one had created and the other had been forced into. Sebastian fell asleep in his luxurious room with the poisonous satisfaction of revenge fulfilled. Jimena did not sleep. She only waited for dawn with her heart full of terror of what was to come. Neither of them knew that in just 3 days everything would change in ways neither of them could have imagined. The sun rose over Veracruz on the morning of March 16, 1847, as it did every day, indifferent to human suffering, illuminating equally the verandas of the big house and the decaying slave quarters. Jimena awoke in her narrow bed, her body aching in places she didn't even know could ache. Not from physical violence, but from the tension of having spent the entire night stiff, expecting something terrible to happen at any moment. The door opened without warning. Yaretsi, a 40-year-old indigenous maid with a face scarred by smallpox, entered carrying a tray. She didn't look at Jimena, simply placed the tray on the small table, bread, cheese, coffee, and left, quickly locking the door again. Jimena looked at the food as if it were poison. It was more food than she normally received in 3 days in the barracks, but her stomach was so constricted with anxiety that she could barely swallow a piece of bread. She spent the entire first day locked in that room. She heard voices outside, footsteps in the corridors, but no one entered. Through the window she watched the slaves working in the sugarcane fields under the brutal sun. She saw Don Rodrigo, Salazar riding between the rows, his whip coiled around his waist like a tamed snake. She saw Kitlali working near the main house and had to bite her lip to keep from shouting his name. She saw Tlaloc carrying sacks of sugarcane 3 times heavier than he should have been carrying, his muscles trembling under the strain. As evening fell, Sebastian finally appeared. He opened the door, looked at Jimena as if checking if a piece of furniture was still in place, and said simply, "Tomorrow you're having dinner with the family. Wear this." He tossed a dress onto the bed. It wasn't luxurious, but it was better than the plain cotton dress she was still wearing. "Behave yourself. Don't speak unless spoken to, and remember who you are." "What am I?" Jimena thought after he left. Am I his wife? Am I his slave? Am I his war trophy against his father? Am I even human anymore? The morning of the second day brought further humiliation. Yaretsi and another maid, Nayeli, entered the room carrying a basin of warm water and soap. Without saying a word, they began to undress Jimena. She tried to resist, covering herself with her arms, but Yaretsi whispered in Zapotec, the first kind word Jimena had heard since her marriage. "Don't fight, child. It will be worse if you fight." They bathed her as if they were bathing a child or an object. They washed her hair with perfumed soap that smelled of lavender, a luxury Jimena had never experienced. They dried her with soft towels. They dressed her in the dress Sebastian had left. A simple but clean, dark blue cotton dress that somehow made her feel even more out of place than the makeshift wedding dress. When Nayeli tried to comb her long hair, she found so many knots, years of work without time or resources for proper care, that she had to cut some with scissors. Jimena felt each cut as a loss of a part of herself. That evening, she was led to dinner. The dining room was even more intimidating than the chapel. The long mahogany table gleamed. Under the light of 3 crystal chandeliers, Don Fernando sat at the head of the table, Doña Mariana to his right, and there were 2 empty places, one next to Sebastian on the opposite side of the table for Jimena. Dinner was refined torture. Each dish served black bean soup, roast beef with tamarind sauce, saffron rice, grilled vegetables, was accompanied by heavy silence. Jimena didn't know how to use the silver cutlery properly. She had never seen a 3-pronged fork in her life. She picked them up as she would work tools, awkwardly, and when she took the first spoonful of soup, she dropped half of it on the way. The soup stained her blue dress. Doña Mariana let out a dramatic sigh of disgust. Don Fernando didn't even look in Jimena's direction. His way of dehumanizing her was to deny her very existence. But Sebastian watched everything with cruel satisfaction. Each of Jimena's mistakes was a new stab in the back for his parents. Each uncomfortable moment was further proof of the profanation he had committed. "Eat," he ordered when he saw that Jimena had stopped, paralyzed with shame. "You are my wife. You have the right to be at this table." "She's a trained animal," Don Fernando finally spoke, his first direct word about Jimena, though he still didn't look at her. "You can dress her in nice clothes, you can seat her at the table, but she's still an animal." "Funny," Sebastian replied, his voice icy, "because according to the chapel records, she now has the same last name as you. So if she's an animal, what does that make us?" The ensuing argument was explosive. Don Fernando slammed his fist on the table, making the porcelain tremble. Doña Mariana wept, saying she would rather be dead than witness the destruction of her family. Sebastian responded with calculated calm, each word chosen to inflict maximum damage, and Jimena remained seated, silent, invisible in the center of that family war, being used as ammunition in a battle that wasn't hers. After dinner, Sebastian escorted her back to her room. In the hallway, he finally said something that sounded remotely human. "You did well." Jimena stopped. She turned to face him, and for the first time since their marriage, she found the courage to say what she really thought. "Do you hate me that much?" The question caught him off guard. "I don't hate you." "Then why?" Her hands trembled, but she kept her gaze steady. "Why are you doing this to me? What did I do to deserve being your weapon?" Sebastian opened his mouth to reply, but no sound came out. Because she was right, absolutely right. He didn't hate her. In fact, he had never thought of her as a real enough person to feel hatred. She was merely a symbol, a tool, a means to an end. And for the first time, looking at that young woman who trembled before him but still stared at him with fierce dignity, he felt something close to shame. "Go back to your room," he said, looking away. "Tomorrow will be easier." That was a lie. The third day was worse. Don Rodrigo Salazar found Jimena alone in the hallway one morning. She had left her room because the door was unlocked. Yaretsi had forgotten to lock it after bringing breakfast. Jimena just wanted to see the sky, feel the air, remember that there was a world beyond those four walls. But Don Rodrigo appeared at the end of the hallway like a demonic apparition. He was 52 years old, with a large, strong body, the kind that had spent his entire life dominating others by force. His face was marked by a scar that ran from his forehead to his chin, a gift from a slave who had tried to resist years before and had been killed for it. His eyes were small and dark, and when he looked at enslaved women, they carried a predatory hunger that they all recognized and feared. "So little Jimena is a lady now," he said, blocking the hallway. His Spanish was heavy with a rough northern Mexican accent. "Wearing pretty dresses, sleeping in soft beds. You think her life has changed, don't you?" Jimena backed up until her face was against the wall. Her heart raced. She knew Don Rodrigo. All the enslaved women knew him. He was a recurring nightmare, the shadow that constantly made them look over their shoulders. "But you and I," he continued, drawing closer, "we know the truth, don't we? We know what you really are, and we know what happened in that shed in January, don't we?" Jimena's blood ran cold. January. She remembered. God, how she remembered. It was a moonless night. She was returning from the water well carrying buckets when Don Rodrigo appeared from the shadows. She tried to run, but he was faster. He pulled her into the empty tool shed. He covered her mouth as she tried to scream. And then, "No," she whispered, tears beginning to roll down her cheeks. "Please, no. Little Sebastian thinks he made you a lady." Don Rodrigo laughed, a humorless sound. "But I made you a woman first, didn't I? And this little secret will stay between us. Because if you tell anyone, I swear by the saints I'll kill you and your brother Tlaloc. Do you understand?" Jimena nodded, unable to speak, her throat constricted with terror. Don Rodrigo finally stepped away, but before leaving he whispered, "Don Fernando gave me orders about you. I'm just waiting for the right moment. Enjoy your days as a lady. They are few." He disappeared down the hallway, and Jimena collapsed to the floor, hugging her knees, her body shaking with silent sobs. She didn't know she was pregnant. Not yet. She hadn't connected the morning sickness she'd been feeling, the small, irregular bleedings, the tenderness in her breasts. She didn't know she carried within her the physical proof of the violence Don Rodrigo had committed. She didn't know that this unwanted pregnancy was about to change absolutely everything. That night, the third dinner was even quieter than the previous ones. Sebastian noticed that Jimena was different, paler, more trembling, her eyes red as if she had been crying for hours. But he didn't ask. Not because he didn't care. Something inside him was beginning to care in a way that frightened him, but because asking would mean acknowledging her humanity completely, and he wasn't ready for that yet. Don Fernando, on the other hand, watched Jimena with the eyes of a predator studying wounded prey. He knew that Don Rodrigo had spoken with her. He knew that the plan was in motion. Soon, very soon, that problem would be solved. The slave would die in an accident, and Sebastian would learn that defying the patriarch had consequences. Jimena barely touched the food. She felt nauseous just looking at the plate. When Doña Mariana commented something about the animal not even knowing how to appreciate good food, Jimena abruptly stood up from the table and ran out of the room, a hand over her mouth. Sebastian found her minutes later in the garden, vomiting among the imported rose bushes that her mother cultivated with obsessive pride. He stood there, unsure what to do, while she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. "Are you sick?" he finally asked. "I'm alive," Jimena replied in a hoarse voice. "I think it's the same here." For the first time in 3 days, Sebastian truly heard the pain in her voice, not as background noise, but as something that demanded attention. And for the first time, he wondered what would happen if he stopped seeing her as a tool and started seeing her as a person. But the answer to that question would only come the next day, and when it did, it would be too late to prevent the tragedy, because some truths once revealed cannot be ignored, and some choices once made cannot be undone. The first 3 days had been a silent hell. But the 4th day would bring something worse, revelation. In the comments, Team Father or Team Son. Write just one word, father or son. The dawn of March 19th, 1847, arrived shrouded in thick mist that rose from the sugarcane fields like ghostly fingers reaching for the sky. Jimena awoke with a pain in her lower abdomen unlike any she had ever felt. It wasn't the familiar ache of tired muscles after a day's work in the fields. It wasn't the hunger that sometimes gnawed at her stomach like a wild animal. It was something deeper, more visceral, as if something inside her was tearing apart. She sat up in bed, dizzy, and felt a warm dampness between her legs. When she pulled back the sheet, she saw red stains spreading across the white. Fabric, blood, so much blood. Her heart raced. She knew that kind of bleeding. She had seen it happen to other women in the slave quarters. Nanetl, Tlali, Xochiquetzal. All of them had lost babies they didn't even know they were carrying, victims of chronic malnutrition, brutal labor, and constant trauma. "No," Jimena whispered to the empty room, her hands trembling as she touched her own belly. "No, no, no." But her body wouldn't listen to her pleas. The pain intensified, waves of cramps that made her double over. She tried to get up, to look for help, but her legs gave way. She fell to the wooden floor with a dull thud that echoed through the silent hallway. The bleeding increased. Red stains spread across the waxed floor that Yaretsi had cleaned the day before. Jimena tried to scream for help, but only a hoarse groan came out. She crawled to the door, leaving a trail of blood behind her, and began banging on the wood with her weak hands. "Please," she pleaded in Zapotec, then in broken Spanish. "Help, please, someone." In the next room, Sebastian had been awake for hours. He hadn't slept well. Nightmares about his father, about Jimena, about the faces of slaves he had seen being whipped during his childhood, all merging into an accusatory mass that pointed at him and whispered, "You're just like him. You're just like your father." When he heard the muffled sounds coming from the next room, he first thought of ignoring them. But something, perhaps growing guilt, perhaps simple human curiosity, made him get up and walk into the hallway. He saw Jimena's bedroom door ajar. He pushed it open completely. What he saw froze him in place. Jimena lay on the floor, curled up in a fetal position, her hands clutching her stomach. Blood, so much blood, pooled around her, staining the blue dress he had given her, staining the light wood of the floor. Her eyes were half closed, her face as pale as candle wax. For 3 full seconds, Sebastian couldn't move. His brain struggled to process the scene. Then the basic first aid training he'd received at university, knowledge he never imagined using, activated automatically. He ran to her, knelt in the pool of blood, not caring about ruining his light linen trousers. "Jimena," he said, his voice coming out strange, high-pitched. "Jimena, what?" "The baby," she whispered in Spanish, each word costing monumental effort. "I'm losing. The baby." Sebastian's world tilted violently on its axis. Baby. She was pregnant. But how? They had never. The marriage was a sham. It had never been consummated. He hadn't even touched her beyond holding her arm at the ceremony. And then the truth hit him like a speeding train. If she was pregnant, and it wasn't his, it meant... Good heavens, it meant someone else had... "Who?" The word came out as a growl. He gently but firmly grasped Jimena's shoulders. "Who did this to you?" Jimena shook her head, tears mingling with sweat and blood on her face. "I can't say. He's going to kill. He's going to kill Tlaloc." "Don Rodrigo," Sebastian said. Not a question. It was absolute certainty. He knew the overseer's reputation. He had heard stories he had chosen to ignore because acknowledging them would mean having to act. It was Don Rodrigo, wasn't it? Jimena's silence was a more eloquent confirmation than any words. Sebastian felt something inside him cracking like ice under excessive weight. For 4 days, he had used that woman as a weapon against his father. He had dragged her into a forced marriage. He had locked her in a room. He had displayed her at dinners as a trophy of her rebellion. And all this time, she carried a trauma he hadn't even bothered to consider. All this time, she was pregnant from a rape that he, with all his privilege and power, could have prevented if he had paid attention to anything other than his own selfish revenge. "I'm sorry," he said, and for the first time in his adult life, the word came out with absolute sincerity. "God, Jimena, I'm sorry. I didn't know. I should have asked. I should have—" "Help me," she interrupted him, her voice weakening. "Please, it hurts. I don't want to die like this." Sebastian screamed for help. His voice echoed through the corridors of the big house like an emergency siren. Yaretsi appeared first, her eyes widening in horror at the sight. Then came Nayeli. Doña Mariana appeared in her silk robe, shouted something about the desecration of her house, and fainted. Again, Don Fernando appeared at the end of the corridor, observed the scene with an inscrutable face, and simply turned and returned to his room without saying a word. "Get the doctor," Sebastian ordered. "Now." "Sir," Yaretsi said hesitantly. "Don Fernando gave orders not to call a doctor for her." Sebastian stood up with such a sudden movement that the maids recoiled. His face was transformed, no longer the spoiled young man throwing a tantrum at his father. It was something different, more dangerous. It was a man confronting for the first time in his life the real consequences of his choices. "I don't care about Don Fernando's orders," he said, each word sharp as glass. "Find Dr. Aguilar, now, or I swear I'll personally go to the city to get him." The maids ran out. Sebastian knelt again beside Jimena. Carefully, as if she were made of porcelain, he lifted her from the blood-soaked floor and carried her to the bed. She weighed almost nothing in his arms, a body consumed by 19 years of forced labor and malnutrition. "Stay with me," he whispered, wiping the sweat-laden hair from her forehead. "Please, stay with me. You'll be okay. I promise. I'll make everything okay." "Why?" Jimena asked, her eyes trying to focus on her face. "Why now? Do you care?" It was a question Sebastian didn't know how to answer. Or perhaps he did, but was afraid to admit it. because for the first time, looking at the woman he had dragged into his cruel game of family revenge, he didn't see a slave. He didn't see a tool. He didn't see a symbol of rebellion. He saw a person. He saw Jimena, someone with her own history, her own pain, her own life that existed independently of him and his war with her father. And recognizing that meant recognizing the magnitude of what he had done to her. "Because I was a monster," he said simply, "and I don't want to be any more." Jimena closed her eyes. The bleeding began to subside, which could be a good sign, or it could mean there was nothing left to lose. Her breathing was weak but regular, and there in that blood-stained room, while they waited for the doctor to arrive, something happened that neither of them expected. Sebastian held Jimena's hand, and she didn't pull it back. It was the first genuinely human touch between them since the forced marriage. There was no romance in it. There was no passion, but there was something more fundamental. There was a mutual recognition of shared humanity. There was, perhaps, for the first time, a possibility of building something upon the ruins of what had been destroyed. Dr. Hernan Aguilar arrived an hour later, a 60-year-old man with white hair and hands stained with ink from years of writing prescriptions. He examined Jimena in professional silence, told Sebastian to leave the room, and worked with Yaretsi and Nayeli for 2 long hours. When he finally came out, his expression was grim. "She lost the baby," he told Sebastian, who was waiting in the hallway, pacing, back and forth like a caged animal. "She was about 2 months pregnant. The miscarriage was complete, which is good. It means there won't be any serious complications. But she lost a lot of blood. She'll need complete bed rest, proper nutrition, and constant care for the next few weeks." "Will she survive?" Sebastian asked, and the urgency in his voice surprised even himself. "Physically, yes. Emotionally." The doctor hesitated. "Young Sebastian, I don't know what's happening in this house. I don't know the circumstances of this marriage, but this young woman has suffered trauma that goes beyond the physical. She's going to need more than medicine. She's going to need kindness. Kindness." The word echoed in Sebastian's mind after the doctor left. He returned to the room where Jimena slept under the effects of the opium-based sedative that Dr. Aguilar had administered. The maids had changed the sheets, cleaned up the blood, and dressed Jimena in a clean nightgown. She seemed even smaller in bed, almost a child, vulnerable in a way that was heartbreaking. Sebastian sat in the chair beside the bed, and for the first time since planning that absurd marriage, he truly thought about Jimena as a person. He tried to imagine what it had been like growing up as a slave, to see her mother die of a treatable disease that was denied treatment because slave lives had no value, to work under the scorching sun 16 hours a day since childhood, to be raped by a man who knew he had absolute power over her, and then, as the poisonous cherry on top of this cake of suffering, to be dragged into marriage with a stranger who saw her only as a tool for revenge. "God," he whispered to the empty room, burying his face in his hands. "What have I done?" Outside in the slave quarters, Tlaloc received the news from Citlali, who had overheard the maids talking. His sister had almost died. She was pregnant, probably by Don Rodrigo. Everyone knew what that demon was capable of. And now she was in the big house, bleeding, alone except for the presence of the man who had used her as a pawn. Tlaloc wanted to go there. He wanted to invade the great house and drag his sister away from that place. But Yolotl held him back, his old hands surprisingly strong. "Not now," the old man said. "Let happen what needs to happen. Sometimes the gods work through strange means." "She is dying," Tlaloc said, tears of anger and helplessness rolling down his face. "She is surviving," Yolotl corrected, "as she has always survived, as her mother survived, as we all survived, and perhaps, just perhaps, something unexpected will emerge from this tragedy. Have faith." Meanwhile, at the main house, Don Fernando found Don Rodrigo in the stables. "What happened?" he asked, his voice low. "The slave is bleeding," Don Rodrigo said disinterestedly. The problem will resolve itself. What if it doesn't get resolved? Don Rodrigo smiled, a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Then I'll finish the job, just as you ordered. Don Fernando nodded and walked away, but for the first time in decades, he felt something akin to unease, not guilt. He had buried that conscience long ago, but perhaps a recognition that things had gone too far, that his son had changed in those 4 days in ways he hadn't foreseen, that the absolute control he had always exerted over his family was slipping through his fingers like sand. Night fell over Veracruz. Jimena slept under the influence of sedatives. Sebastian remained by the bedside, watching, thinking, transforming, because sometimes it only takes 4 days for an entire world to crumble, and sometimes from that crumble, something new can begin to grow. But the story wasn't over yet. In fact, it was only just beginning. If you feel like this isn't going to end well, leave a like so I know you're with me until day 4. The following days unfolded like a tapestry, being woven with threads of unexpected transformation. Jimena remained, bedridden for 5 full days, her body slowly recovering from blood loss, but her soul still carrying wounds that no doctor could heal. And during those 5 days, something extraordinary happened. Sebastian stayed by her side, not as an obligation, not as a performance to irritate his father, but because, for the first time in his privileged life, he was witnessing the direct consequences of the power structure he had always accepted as natural and inevitable. Every groan of pain from Jimena was an accusation. Every time she woke up screaming from nightmares, it was judgment. Every empty stare when she stared at the ceiling was a mirror showing Sebastian exactly the monster he had become. On the 3rd day of her recovery, Jimena finally spoke more than monosyllables. Sebastian was sitting beside her bed, reading aloud from a book of poetry. She didn't know why he started doing it, perhaps just to fill the terrible silence of the room. It was Mexican poetry, verses about freedom and homeland. When he finished a particularly beautiful poem about birds breaking cages, Jimena whispered, "Can you read?" Sebastian put down the book, confused by the question. "Yes, I learned it when I was 5 years old." "I don't know," she said simply. "Slaves don't learn. They're not allowed to." The simplicity of that statement hit him like a punch in the gut. Of course she couldn't read. How could she? When would she have time amid 16 hours of forced labor a day? Who would teach her? When there were explicit laws against educating slaves, because educated slaves were dangerous slaves. "I could teach you," he heard himself saying. "If you want." Jimena turned her head slowly to look at him, really look at him. "Why?" "Because you should have had the chance to learn when you were 5 years old," Sebastian replied. "And you didn't, and that's unfair. And I've been part of this system of injustice my whole life, without questioning it. So maybe starting to teach you is a small beginning of trying to fix something." "You can't fix it," Jimena said, but her voice held no anger, only weariness. "You can't give me back my mother. You can't erase what Don Rodrigo did. You can't undo years of pain. You're just a man, and some damage is permanent." "I know," Sebastian admitted, "but I can try not to cause any more harm, and perhaps if I try hard enough, I can prevent others from suffering what you suffered." Jimena closed her eyes. Beautiful words. But words don't nourish people. They don't liberate people. They don't save people. "So what saves people?" he asked, genuinely wanting to know. "Actions," she replied simply. "Courageous actions. Actions that cost something. Are you willing to lose everything you have to do what is right?" That was the question that would define everything that came after. Sebastian didn't answer immediately. He sat in silence for a long time, thinking. Was he willing? Willing to challenge his father in a real way, not just symbolically? Willing to risk his inheritance, his social standing, perhaps even his life? Willing to transform that absurd marriage that had begun as selfish revenge into something with real meaning? "I don't know," he finally admitted, "but I want to find out, if you'll help me." And so began the most unlikely partnership. In the following days, while Jimena regained her strength, they talked. They really talked, for the first time since their marriage. She told him about life in the slave quarters, about how slaves developed secret communication networks, signals that sent information about violent overseers, about possible escape routes, about planned revolts. She told him about her mother, Xochitl, who had been a healer in her Zapotec village before being captured and sold. She told him about Tlaloc, who secretly taught enslaved children about Zapotec history, about ancestral gods, about the identity that the masters tried to erase. Sebastian, in turn, spoke about growing up in a gilded cage, about the pressure of being the sole heir to an empire, about witnessing violence and learning to normalize it, about studying laws that protected slaves on paper but were never implemented in practice, and about discovering slowly that everything he had been taught about the natural order of things was a construct created to justify the unjustifiable. "My professor at university," he said one afternoon, "used to say that slavery would eventually end, that it was economically unsustainable, morally indefensible. But when would it end? After how many more generations of suffering?" "And what did you answer?" Jimena asked. "Nothing," Sebastian admitted, "because I thought it was a theoretical, abstract problem, something to think about in academic essays, but not to act on. But now I see that every day that passes without action is another day of people like you suffering." It was Jimena who had the idea. On the 10th day after the abortion, when she was strong enough to sit up in bed without help, she said, "You have power that I will never have. You are a man, you are white, you are rich, you are an heir. The same things that make you part of the problem could make you part of the solution, if you wanted to." "How?" Sebastian asked, leaning forward. "Documents," she said, her eyes gleaming with a sharp intelligence that years of slavery had failed to dull. "You have access to your father's office. You have access to official seals, to property papers. You could create manumission documents." "Fake liberation," Sebastian said slowly, the weight of the idea settling in. "That would be treason against my father, against the entire elite of Veracruz. If they found out, you would lose everything," Jimena finished. "Maybe you'd be killed. So I understand if you don't." "I will do it," he interrupted her. "But I can't do it alone. I'll need help. Yours, Tlaloc's, people who know who else needs urgent liberation." Jimena studied him for a long time. "If you're doing this to clear your conscience, it doesn't work that way. You don't become a hero just because you decided to stop being a villain." "I know," Sebastian said. "I'm not looking for redemption. I can't be redeemed, but maybe I can be useful, and maybe that's enough." The plan gradually took shape, in whispered conversations, in secret meetings. Sebastian began frequenting his father's office when Don Fernando was away inspecting other properties. He studied property documents, learned how slave records were kept, where official seals were stored. He discovered that his father kept a ledger with a complete list of all the slaves, names, ages, purchase histories, estimated values. Meanwhile, Jimena served as a bridge between the big house and the slave quarters. Through Yaretsi and Nayeli, who began to trust her, messages reached Tlaloc. Jimena's brother, initially suspicious, agreed to help when he realized the plan was real. He had connections. He knew people on other farms. He knew escape routes through the mountains. He knew Quilombo communities where runaway slaves created hidden free societies. The first manumission document was created on May 3, 1847. It was for Citlali, Jimena's best friend. The paper stated that she had been freed by her master, Don Fernando de Mendoza, in gratitude for years of loyal service. It was a complete lie, but it had the correct stamp, a perfectly forged signature, and the appropriate date. When Citlali received the document from Tlaloc, she wept. She wept like she had never wept in her life. Freedom, A concept so abstract it seemed mythical, suddenly became real in her hands, on the thin paper she held as if it were sacred. That night, she fled. She followed the route Tlaloc had mapped, through the sugarcane fields under the cover of darkness, to the mountains where the Quilombo community awaited her. It was only the beginning. During May and June of 1847, Sebastian forged 47 manumission documents. 47 people, men, women, and children, received freedom stolen from a system that imprisoned them. Each escape was carefully orchestrated. Each freed person received instructions on where to go, how to avoid slave catchers' patrols, and how to find safe communities. Don Fernando didn't realize it immediately. His farm was too large, his slaves too numerous. Some escapes were normal. They happened every year. But when he lost 20 slaves, in 3 weeks, he began to suspect something was wrong. He ordered Don Rodrigo to increase vigilance, organize night patrols, and raise punishments to discourage escape attempts. And then, on July 15th, everything fell apart. Don Rodrigo stormed the slave quarters at dawn after a denunciation by a collaborating slave, a man named Tenoch, who hoped to gain favors by betraying his brothers. He found Tlaloc hiding forged documents under a loose floorboard. He dragged him to the central square of the farm and began to beat him publicly, demanding to know who was supplying the papers. Tlaloc spat blood, but said nothing. Don Rodrigo broke 3 of his fingers. Tlaloc screamed but did not speak. Don Rodrigo prepared the whip, ready to lash to death. That's when Sebastian appeared. He had heard the commotion from the big house. He ran to the central square where hundreds of slaves were gathered, forced to witness punishment. He saw Tlaloc tied to the post. He saw Don Rodrigo with his whip raised. He saw his father watching from the balcony with a satisfied expression. "Stop!" Sebastian shouted, his voice echoing through the silent farm. Don Rodrigo froze. Don Fernando slowly rose from his chair. All eyes turned to Sebastian. "Let him go," Sebastian ordered, walking to the center of the square. "Now, this slave," Don Rodrigo said, "is involved in a conspiracy to steal his father's property. He will die as an example." "No," Sebastian said, stopping a few meters from Tlaloc. Looked at the bound man, swollen face, broken fingers, blood running from his mouth, and saw Jimena's brother. He saw a human being who had risked everything for freedom. "He won't die because he wasn't the one who forged the documents. I was." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the birds seemed to stop singing. Don Fernando descended slowly from the balcony, his footsteps echoing on the packed earth. When he reached Sebastian, his face was pale with suppressed anger. "What did you say?" he asked, his voice dangerously low. "I said," Sebastian repeated, looking his father in the eye for the first time without looking away, "that it was me. I forged 47 manumission documents. I freed 47 of your slaves, and I will do it again until I free every person imprisoned on this farm, or until you kill me. Whichever comes first." Don Fernando slapped him. The sound of the palm against his face echoed like a gunshot. Sebastian staggered but remained standing. His father raised his hand to strike again, but stopped when he saw something he had never seen before in his son's eyes: unwavering determination. "You destroyed everything," Don Fernando said, his voice breaking. "Everything I built, everything my father built. 3 generations ruined because of your ridiculous idealism. You are a coward. You are a traitor. You are—" "I'm your son," Sebastian interrupted. "And you raised me to be this way. You sent me to study. You taught me to think. You gave me the freedom to question, and when I questioned, I learned that everything you built was built on the suffering of thousands of people. So yes, I will destroy it, with pleasure." Don Fernando recoiled, as if he had been physically struck. He turned to Don Rodrigo. "Arrest him, arrest my son." But before Don Rodrigo could move, Jimena appeared. She had run from the big house, alerted by Yaretsi. She stopped beside Sebastian, her body still weak but her presence strong. "If you arrest him," she said in broken but understandable Spanish, "You'll have to arrest me too, because I helped. I planned it. I chose who to release." "Me too," said Yeretzi's voice, emerging from the crowd of slaves. "Me too," said Nayeli. "Me too," said Yolotl, the old slave, rising with difficulty. One by one, slaves began to step forward, declaring complicity, choosing resistance over submission. Until that moment, they were isolated individuals, broken by the system. But something changed, perhaps witnessing a young master defying his own father, perhaps seeing the possibility of freedom realized in 47 successful escapes. They found a collective voice. Don Fernando looked around, watching the control he had maintained for decades crumble before his eyes. He had Don Rodrigo. He had other overseers. He had weapons. He could order a massacre. He could hang Sebastian as an example. He could burn everything and start over. But when he looked into his son's eyes, he saw something that paralyzed him. He saw a younger version of himself. He saw idealism that he himself once possessed decades ago, before power and greed completely corrupted him. He saw a choice being made between perpetuating the cycle of violence or breaking it. "Get out," he said finally, his voice hoarse. "Get off my property. You, the slave you call your wife, and any of those traitors who want to follow you. But know that you are dead to me, and without my money, without my name, without my protection, you will fail. You will die in misery, and I will be here, rebuilding everything you tried to destroy." Sebastian looked at Jimena. She nodded. He looked at Tlaloc, still tied to the post. Don Rodrigo released him with a disgusted expression. He looked at dozens of faces, Yolotl, Yeretzi, Nayeli, others, people who risked everything to follow an uncertain path toward freedom. "So that's it," Sebastian said. "We're going." And they went. On that afternoon in July 1847, 123 people left Hacienda San Miguel del Rosario. Sebastián de Mendoza y Córdoba abandoned his fortune, his name, his secure future. Jimena left behind decades of suffering, but also the only life she knew. Together, with an unlikely army of freed slaves, they began their journey north, where Tlaloc knew of Quilombo communities that would welcome them. In the following months, Sebastian used legal knowledge he had learned at university to help establish a free community in the mountains of the Sierra Madre. Oriental, he taught people to read, write, and understand laws that theoretically protected them. Jimena used knowledge of medicinal herbs she had learned from her mother to become the community's healer. Tlaloc organized a defense system against slave hunters and patrols of angry landowners. It wasn't an easy life. They suffered hunger, disease, and attacks. Many died in their first winter in the mountains, but they were free. And for those who had spent their lives imprisoned, freedom was worth any price. Sebastian and Jimena never developed a fairy tale romance. Trauma doesn't disappear just because someone decides to be better. But they developed mutual respect, a partnership built on shared scars and common goals. Years later, Jimena would say that Sebastian saved her life. He would correct her, "You saved my soul." In 1850, news of his free community spread throughout Veracruz. It inspired other escapes, other revolts, other landowners questioning the system. Don Fernando died. In 1852, bitter and alone, his fortune dwindling, his name tarnished, Hacienda San Miguel del Rosario was sold, divided, eventually abandoned. The story of the prince who married a slave became a legend, but the truth behind the legend was more complex than any fairy tale. It was a story about how wrong choices can lead to unexpected redemption, about how recognizing the humanity of another requires sacrificing one's own privilege, about how systems of oppression crumble not through grand heroic gestures, but through small acts of resistance accumulated over time. And when Jimena died at 68, surrounded by children and grandchildren who were born free, Sebastian, now 73, held her hand and whispered, "Thank you for not giving up on me when I didn't deserve your compassion." She smiled, her eyes tired but satisfied. Thank you for finally learning that some things are worth more than gold. This is a true story, not one of love at first sight, but of painful transformation, not of a white savior, but of broken people finding strength in collective resistance, not of an easy, happy ending, but of the daily choice of dignity over comfort. And perhaps the most important lesson is this: our worst choices don't define us forever, but only if we have the courage to acknowledge them, confront them, and spend the rest of our lives trying to do things differently. Because real change is never comfortable, it's never painless, but it's always worth it. And you? What unjust systems are you perpetuating without questioning? What privileges are you willing to sacrifice to do what is right? The answers to these questions can define not only your story, but the future of people you don't even know yet. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because stories that change the way we see the world deserve to be shared.